Next up we have Professor Andrew Brown from Leeds University. Oh, the system tells me Professor Brown can't be with us today, but he joins us live by video link from his hollowed out volcano in the Maldives. Andy? No, it's not working. Well, I'll tell you what then. We'll do this instead. So originally Andy was going to come and present on the economic changes or the economic analysis that's been done in this project. Unfortunately, Andy's not able to join us for reasons I suspect most of you know. And so he said to me, why don't you go and do it instead? And I was a bit reluctant at first. And then after about 3 seconds, I said, yes, of course I will, because I love talking. So here I am. But this is very much the musings of an engineer on working with economists. This is not an economic analysis of what we've done in iBUILD. But it's very much based on Andy's work and his team, and I know his interactions with Peter and Andy O'Brien and various other people. So Richard alluded to this earlier. We undervalue our infrastructure, that much is clear. If we look at the report cards that come from the various civil engineering organisations, they invariably say that our infrastructure is in a parlous and terrible state. Now, you could argue that because they're civil engineering organisations, they would say that, wouldn't they? But most of them are fairly reputable. And large sums of money are bandied around as being required to actually fix the parlous state of infrastructure in major industrialised Western countries. And this in 2010 was finally reflected by the UK government. The UK government said that for several decades, the UK's approach to infrastructure investment has been timid, uncoordinated, incremental and wasteful. These famous words that grace the very first page of the 2010 National Infrastructure Plan and were, of course, subsequently hurriedly removed from all subsequent versions of the Infrastructure Plan. But originally, it was considered a big enough problem that managed to get past that sentence managed to get past the Sir Humphreys. That's how worried the UK government was about infrastructure. So where does this underinvestment stem from? Well, as Richard said, it's about undervaluation, or perhaps more correctly, incorrect evaluation. So those of you who are native to this parish will recognise that flyover. That's the A4 Hammersmith flyover leading into West London. And that was built in 1961 at a cost of 1.3 million, which in 2013 pounds is about 22.8 million. In 2013, it was finally decided that the thing was actually at the stage where it was about to collapse. I won't tell you the story of why. And the repair cost of this was £72 million, considerably more, even in adjusted money, than the original building cost. The reason for this, because the maintenance was deprioritised in the various governing bodies' budgets. And so we have this serious issue about the value of infrastructure. We have a financial and economic and accountancy system which very much values the short-term aspects of infrastructure, and yet we fail to properly account for the value which is generated by our infrastructure and by the resources that flow through our infrastructure and by the services that those resources provide. And so naturally we said, well, if there's a valuation problem, we need to turn to economists. Now, there's a very famous joke, most of you will know this. A dairy farmer was having problems with his milk yields, and so he went to his local university and said, okay, I'd like you to analyse what's going on my farm, and I'd like to tell you how I can increase my milk yields. So they put together a transdisciplinary team of ethnographers and geographers, and they headed, this joke's normally done with the head being a physicist, but today I'm going to say the head of it was an engineer. And so they went away, they spent several days on the farm collecting data, they went back to the university, and they said to the head, who was a physicist or an engineer, depending on who you're aiming the joke at, you can write the report and report back to the farmer. And sure enough, a week later, he reports back to the farmer, and the head of the team said, "We have come up with a solution to your milk yields. Unfortunately, it only works for spherical cows in a vacuum." And we're okay with this as engineers, because we know that sometimes the spherical cow in a vacuum gets you close enough to the answer that you can actually do some genuine work. The equations we use to calculate how much steel you need to put into concrete aren't much better than spherical cows in a vacuum. The equations we use to understand how the ground behaves when we remove the overburden or add more weight onto it aren't much better than spherical cows in a vacuum. But they're close enough for us to make serious engineering judgments. And sure enough, we thought when we talk to the economist, they'll have some spherical cows in a vacuum, and we can use that to help us revalue our infrastructure. And they said, you know what? We've got a perfect spherical cow in a vacuum. It's called marginal utility theory. And what marginal utility theory says is basically the value of small changes in utility to rational consumers, seize that word, is reflected in market prices and drives the system to the optimum allocation of resources. Brilliant, perfect. We like that. That sounds very good. And this is exemplified. Sorry, the slides have got a bit mangled in the transfer to the template. This is exemplified in this famous equation CMC. So we take one commodity, and through the exchange value of money, we can transfer that into a different commodity. And through this system and the invisible hand of the market, we eventually end up with a Pareto optimum allocation of resources. And this leads us to the sine qua non of these spherical cow for economics, which is general equilibrium models. The invisible hand of the market, CMC, works, but only under restrictively unrealistic assumptions. And so what we need to do is add the equivalent of shape and air resistance to the cow in order that we can get the model to give us some sensible answers. And we call adding shape and air resistance to the cow in economics externalities. That's what the economists like to call shape and air resistance, externalities. And these are generally discussed in the context of market failures. And it's these market failures which are used to justify state interventions. And in order to get round some of the inconvenient truths that many of the things that we trade commodities for aren't to make money, they're to give us social value or to change environmental values, we try and monetize those values. That's basically how this orthodox, this accepted, this mainstream economic theory works. And as engineers, we rather naively thought, well, with a few tweaks, we can get this to revalue our infrastructure. The problem is, when you apply marginal utility theory to infrastructure, you get an epic fail. Basically, virtually all of the assumptions that underpin the operation of marginal utility theory break down when you try and apply it to infrastructure. So first of all, infrastructure is rife with externalities. In fact, it's almost the definition of an externality. We spend money in order to get social benefits, public health, productivity, mobility, and so on and so forth. Infrastructure we generally think of as a quasi-public good, which means it's non-rival, which means that if you add one more person, it doesn't cost much more to use it, and it's non-excludable. We can't stop people from using it. This makes it difficult to charge for it. This means if you let the market provide infrastructure, it won't provide a socially optimum amount of infrastructure. We see the emergence of natural monopolies in infrastructure. Usual marginal utility theory has no place for business models. It has no concept of value, and yet clearly we need business models and value to operate infrastructure. Uncertainty for infrastructure is highest of all the sectors because, of course, we want infrastructure to last well over 100 years in many places. How do you plan for that length of time? Marginal utility theory can't cope with things being that long. Infrastructure is a system of systems. Providing infrastructure itself changes the economy, so you have non-marginal effects. You can't assume that the system is exogenous, and you have endogenous preferences. The market theory is based on people want what they get, and instead it's what you get is what you want with infrastructure. The fact that we provide infrastructure means that people decide to consume what that infrastructure provides, rather than people decide what infrastructure they want by definition of what they consume. So the whole basis of marginal utility theory falls apart when it's pointed at economics. Andy's probably quite glad he's not here at this point. And so what we recognise from our systems of provision approach is that there is an alternative way of framing this. And the way that with the economists that we dealt with, the heterodox economists who recognise that marginal utility theory is a fiction, is that it's a profit game. It's not actually CMC, it's MCM. Money buys commodities which go into a production system, which make more commodities, which make more money, which means that you generate profit by M dash minus M, and it's not actually the Pareto optimum allocation of resources which stabilizes the system. The system is actually driven by profit. And if the system is driven by profit, then you have A, the potential for crises, and we've seen that over recent years. You will have the potential for crises because you're actually trying to make money, not distribute resources. It means that you get a drift towards financialization, and what this means from infrastructure is that you've got to move towards infrastructure as an asset class. This general drift away from the idea of infrastructure providing effectively the basis on which the economy works to infrastructure itself becoming an asset class. And systems of provision says we need to look more carefully at that, and this has been completely mangled by the transfer, never mind. And in particular, what's a social provisioning approach rather than a marginal utility approach for infrastructure says is that there are two types of value. You have use value and you have exchange value. The use value is what you buy the infrastructure for, what it provides to society, the needs of the communities, the social value, environmental value, and you also have exchange value. which is, if you like, the money value of the system. But there are two very different aspects to that exchange value. There's the exchange value that you try and capture, which is the selling the infrastructure in the market, selling asset, capturing revenue streams by renting the infrastructure out. But you also have the long-term creation of exchange value, where you hold on to your infrastructure and use the infrastructure itself to generate revenue streams. And our current focus on only this aspect of the exchange value is the focus of our current business models, and this has repeatedly been demonstrated to be unsustainable. And as we drift towards financializing infrastructure and turning it into an asset class, we are building in inherent instabilities into the system. These crises are not externalities. The crises in this capitalist system are not externalities, they are completely built into the system. If the system is driven by the accumulation of profit, then crises will inevitably occur. And we need to look at this more carefully. And so that, if you like, the system that we've used, the system that we took to try and analyse infrastructure more carefully is this systems of provision. And what systems of provision says, first of all, is each of these infrastructure systems is specific. It's a very specific thing. They're irreducibly specific. There is no one-size-fits-all model like marginal utility theory which can explain the operation of infrastructure systems. And what you actually need to do is analyse what's happening from production to consumption. And there's that word again, production versus consumption. We should be focusing on production. We don't consume infrastructure, we are provided with infrastructure. So it is production that should be driving the analysis, not consumption. And we need to look through that chain of events that happens between production and consumption. And back again, we need to look at the structures of ownership, control and delivery. We need to look at the processes, the wider processes that affect infrastructure, such as globalisation and privatisation. We need to look at the institutions, producers and consumers, the agents that live within that system, and particularly we need to look at the relationships between those agents, in particular the power relationships between those agents. There is a severe power imbalance all the way along that chain, and we need to look at the motivations and aims of the agents in that system. And only by looking at this across the width of a system like this can we ever hope to really understand what the true value of our infrastructure is. And to give you an example of how that system of provision works, there's a very simple example here from Ben Fine's analysis of the dairy system. Is Ben here today? Good, because that means if I get anything wrong, he won't shout at me. And so we analyse the dairy system and we see wider forces outside of this system say the rise of supermarket retailing has meant you've got an availability of healthier low-fat milks. Great. You've got more low-fat milk, higher availability, that's being driven by the consumer. Consumer wants low-fat milk, so they'll drink low-fat milk, they'll all get healthier. Yes, that's what marginal utility theory will tell you about the dairy system. But if you actually analyse what's happening, this doesn't stop the production system from producing high-fat milk. That fat has to go somewhere. And so what happens is, although you've taken the fat out the milk to make low-fat milk, you take that fat, i.e. cream, and you use it to make high-fat dairy products. You use it to make creams and cheeses. So the wider range of low-fat milk has not led to a reduction in high-fat milk production or consumption, and in fact the cream goes into cheeses and desserts and manufactured foods, all readily available in the supermarket, and ironically those who bought the healthy milk were also the consumers of the cheeses and the dairy products. So this is a system which, although on the face of it is driven by consumption, is a lovely neoclassical, neoliberal, consumer-driven Pareto optimization of allocation system. It isn't, because at the root of the system is the continued production of high-fat dairy milk, because it turns out you can't make cows produce low-fat milk. You have to turn it into low-fat milk using machines. Who knew? So in terms of infrastructure, what does this help us explain? Well, first of all, it helps us explain quandaries like this. Whenever we do analyses of resilience, let's build resilience into our infrastructure systems. Let's build in that headroom capacity. Let's add those extra conduits. Let's add those extra lanes because we might need them later. And any analysis is, yes, this is a really good idea. It will bear fruit. But it always bears fruit in the future. And this means because of the ridiculous way in which we value infrastructure, these obviously beneficial interventions have a low initial cost-benefit ratio, so they never actually get built into the system. Now, this doesn't allow us to change that analysis, but it provides us with the narrative that explains why this dichotomy between the value of the long-term value of resilience and the short-term cost-benefit ratio causes this not to actually happen, despite the fact we know it's a good idea. It also helps us make the case for state provision. Many of those failures in terms of investing in infrastructure can only be remediated by the state. Only the state, for example, can provide that long-term guarantee of capital and that underwriting of the very long-term uncertainty which is necessary for the investment in infrastructure. And this is reflected in the historical ways in which the state has always played a part in the development of most technologies and in the development of infrastructure in particular. Again, it doesn't solve the problem, but it gives you analysis which allows you to talk about these things. And when we look at major infrastructure failures, and Carillion, why has Carillion failed? Over financialisation. Why did East Coast fail? Because over financialisation. Why did Southern Cross fail? Over financialisation. And in each of these cases, they are allowed to fail or permitted to fail or given a mechanism to fail because they know that the state is the provider of last resort. And if they fail, the state must step in. And that risk is being underpriced in the contracts that are actually being awarded. Again, this doesn't solve the problem, but it gives you a narrative framework outside of marginal utility theory that allows you to talk about these problems. Have we talked about them? Yes, we have. We've talked about them in terms of the Valuing Infrastructure Conference, which Professor Brown organised. Many of you went to, a very successful conference. We've managed to actually to change government guidance on how you value infrastructure by the Green Book. We've undertaken extensive HMG, local government consultations, in how they can revalue their infrastructure. I know there ought to be a killer paper by now, but it turns out this stuff's difficult. It's even more difficult than fluid dynamics. So we're working on it, and we've got some stuff. We're being prepared for the major economics journals. If you want a taster of what we're going to put out, then have a look at Elke Perkmeyer's paper in Ecological Economics, the neoclassical Trojan horse of steady-state economics. So you don't get titles like that in civil engineering, do you? It's an excellent paper. It's already generating a lot of interest, and it gives you a taster of how challenging these economic orthodoxies rouses the people who promote these orthodoxies. And we've pulled together about £20 million in further grants. And if you look on the AIR Centre, which is if you like, the Heterodox Economics Centre at Leeds University, look on their website. You can see many of these grants that some of this thinking has actually pulled out of the ether. A lot of this stuff, or all of this stuff, in fact, is in collaboration with other universities, with other countries, with local government, with local councils, with Leeds Council in particular. So we have made a difference. And so, in summary, what it's taught us to do is not to think about spherical cows. Stop trying to sphericize the cows and put them in vacuums. Accept the fact that every cow is different. Accept the fact that every cow has a different motivation. Accept the fact that all these cows have relationships between them, and all these cows will behave in different ways. Don't try and hide that. Start your narrative from that point that every cow is different, instead of trying to stuff it in a sphere and put it in a vacuum. And that is very much a set of random musings of an engineer on economics, and so thank you very much for your attention.